question. Thank you. Okay, so thinking about your joints and what causes inflammation in your joints, we're just going to have a quick look at what inflammation is, and then have a look at the effects of stress on inflammation, and also take in inflammatory fluids and foods, because it's not just foods that can contribute to inflammation, and then think about reducing it. And I'm going to have a quick look at something running next year called the Energy Journey, in case it's of interest. But if we think about acute inflammation, and actually Sue's finger is a really great example of that this evening. Sorry, Sue. There's a master protein called NF-κB that contributes to inflammation processes that are quite protective, really, initially, because they help your injured tissues repair and regenerate. They stop infection from getting into that area. But the effects that they have are to cause a lot of blood vessel dilation in the area, which causes redness, throbbing, heat. An injury can swell up. Obviously, there's a lot of pain because of all the nerve endings that are affected as well. And so that acute inflammation is very, very useful. But if you can imagine, if there are foods that you consume that cause the same type of inflammation as an injury would do, but day in, day out, year in, year out, then that's going to cause a huge problem long term, because that master protein stimulates the production of things like reactive oxygen species, which cause oxidative stress in your body. It's a bit like your body going rusty, like a rusty nail. And if you bring a lot of antioxidants into your diet through fresh foods, then you can combat that. Then you've got things like neutrophils, which are probably about 40% to 70% of your white blood cells are neutrophils. So you get an immune response with chronic inflammation. And of course, that means that your immune system is taken up dealing with that inflammation. Interleukins and cytokines are part of your immune system as well. So a huge amount of the battery of reserves that you have for immunity is drawn into this daily battle with inflammation. And then you've got COX-2 enzymes as well, which you use to make short-acting tissue hormones, which are called prostaglandins. And your prostaglandins can either be anti-inflammatory or inflammatory. Now, the problem with anti-inflammatory drugs is that they also mediate or reduce the action of COX-1 enzymes, and COX-1 enzymes actually help protect your stomach lining. So this is why anti-inflammatories can be so damaging for your stomach, because they actually diminish the lining of your stomach. Is there anything else to say about that? I'm just thinking. No, I don't think so. Any questions about any of those? No. Okay. So thinking about inflammation, it often starts during or after a period of prolonged stress, because there are things that happen while you're stressed that can promote a situation of greater inflammation in your body. So certainly under stress, inflammation rises. Your blood sugar, your ability to manage your blood sugar is very much put under stress itself, because of the cortisol hormone triggering a release of sugar from the liver and the muscles, and then you produce insulin. If you're not using it, you store it away. And so you go into a bit of a roller coaster cycle with blood sugar, but then your immune system goes down because of the increased inflammation. And so a period of stress is often the beginnings of an inflammatory condition for people, like joint inflammation, for example, which can become as serious as arthritis and even rheumatoid arthritis if the immune system's working against itself. And so thinking about the various types of stress that can come in and cause inflammation, things like the pesticides and herbicides. So if we can access wild, organic, biodynamic, all the better. Preservatives on food, heavy metals in the environment from those, things like fillings, like vaccines, for example, high in aluminium and mercury. Cleaning products and body care products can be real environmental stressors. Airborne chemicals, such as all the pollutants from traffic and so on, and from industry. Smoking, even if we don't smoke ourselves, if we're around a smoker, or if we're obviously inhaling passive smokers as we go by. Prescription and street drugs are a form of environmental stress too. Then there's the physical stresses that we can put the body under. So over-exercising, too much sort of marathon type exercise without enough rest, without enough hydration following on from the exercise, because for every hour of exercise, ideally, we should drink an extra pint of water. Overeating, bringing foods into the body that are common allergens, such as wheat and dairy, for example. A high sugar intake and snacking, salty snacks as well, causes, again, that huge roller coaster inside the body of your sugar metabolism, which sugar can be such a beginning of stress in the body. A low-fat diet is stressful. And we'll just have a look with dairy about what happens when they make that low-fat. Skipping meals, again, because you're putting more stress on your body, relying on your body to deal with your sugar metabolism, rather than mechanically keeping the blood sugar balanced with a regular meal. Although, of course, the fast that we have is also important. The fast with the rest as we sleep is also important in order to make sure that we don't overstretch or put too much stress on our digestion and our ability to keep our blood sugar steady naturally for several hours, which we should be able to do. And then, of course, caffeine and alcohol create more dehydration in the body, which creates more physical stress. And then, of course, we've got all the mental, emotional stress that can pop up during life: job, financial, health, housing, family, etc., etc. And then, of course, where we've got high cortisol from any of those situations that we've just mentioned, physical, mental, emotional, environmental, we become more prone to inflammation. And any of the disorders that we're sort of looking at here could take hold of the body. And so one of the first factors I'd mention, one of the first foods I'd mention as being highly inflammatory, is always wheat. But one of the difficulties is that, and I probably mentioned this a few weeks ago when we talked about the other environmental stress that I didn't actually mention, which is EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies, such as mobile phone, for example, and Wi-Fi, in that when we are exposed to that type of radiation, it's having a bigger and bigger effect on reducing our ability to manage sugar, for our body to regulate sugar levels. And so not only wheat, in fact, but a lot of grains are becoming more and more difficult for people to digest, because they all break down into sugar. And years ago, 22 years ago, when I first trained in nutrition, one of the most important, protocol for cancer from a dietary perspective, for example, was something along the lines of the Gerson therapy, which really brought a lot of raw foods into the diet, a lot of raw juices, and that helped to create a situation of high antioxidants in the body. Now, predominantly at that time, a lot of the juices that people were advised to do were carrot. But now, 20 years later, that simply would not be the case, because the carrot would be far, far too sweet for someone with a cancer diagnosis. Because where we were saying in the slide before that sugariness is contributing to the inflammation, even a vegetable juice such as carrot will be far, far too sweet. And so something more like a celery juice will be more appropriate. And so just thinking about the fact that wheat, rye, barley, rice, even quinoa, buckwheat, millet, they all break down into a sugar. And that in itself can be highly inflammatory. And then, of course, modern wheats, like the durum wheats, are very, very high in gluten. And gosh, well, gluten, the clue's in the name, really, because what it does is it glues you up. It's very, very good at coating the intestine in a gluey-like substance once it's mixed with the water in our digestive system. And gluten can literally give a feeling at brain level of feeling fogged up. It is a highly inflammatory substance. It's been mooted in research for conditions like MS, so multiple sclerosis. So you can tell just from that how inflammatory it is. And about nearly 50 years ago, in the 1970s, before any of us knew anything about genetic modification, the manufacturers spliced in an extra protein alongside the gluten called gliadin into durum wheat. And this is why durum wheat is so different from a wheat like spelt, for example, that is the original grain, which is about 60% lower in gluten. So those two proteins help make the bread much more doughy and soft, whereas an artisan bread several years ago would have been quite dense. And gliadin actually is a protein that will target the opiate receptors in the brain and give a temporary feel-good feeling because it's targeting the opiate receptors. And sugar does exactly the same thing as wheat does generally. They all target the opiate receptors, and they give that buzz, that feeling of feeling quite comforted and satisfied, and the kind of feeling that an opiate lift in the brain will give. But it's very, very temporary. It's not a long-term response in the brain, and it's not a very healthy one, because it takes more and more of it to target the opiate receptors each time to get the same kind of response, particularly when somebody typically uses these foods a lot. And the other thing, of course, is that, again, you're back to that situation where we've broken down the glucose in the grains into sugar, particularly wheat, and we've got an inflammatory response from that, which will contribute to any inflammation in the body. And sugar itself, so cakes, biscuits, sweets, chocolates, sugary drinks, exactly the same situation, only with a bit like rocket fuel, really. Straight away, you've got an inflammatory response, and the immune system, because of that inflammatory response to a sugar intake, can lower it massively in what it's able to do to respond to an infection, for example, because the inflammatory response is far too busy handling the effects of the sugar. And so then if we look at dairy, again, another inflammatory food, it can cause an enormous amount of inflammation in the mucous membranes, in the lungs and the nose, and a huge amount of inflammation in the digestion as well for some people. I've worked over the years with people, and some people, if they stop dairy immediately, any situation with a loose gut or diarrhea will stop completely, if they're not allergic to wheat as well, of course. And what happens, and this is what we were saying a couple of slides ago, that when we lower fat, for example, in a dairy product, what we do is we concentrate the sugar content. And so the other thing is that dairy is naturally high in sodium, and really after weaning, about 65% of people do not produce the enzyme required to break down the dairy. And so all of these, if you can imagine, if you think about in nature, none of these products would naturally occur in nature without a human being making them. And so all mammals produce a milk for their young, but once they're weaned, there wouldn't generally be a situation where they stop having the milk, and so we'd make them some cheese, if that makes sense. And so then looking at fluids, alcohol is also highly inflammatory because, again, eventually it will break down into a sugar. And the other thing about alcohol, of course, is that it's dehydrating. And so the more dehydrated you are, the more the situation where the acid wastes that are already in your body become more concentrated, and it's much more difficult for them to leave the body. And so then you get a situation where they're backing up, in the fluids around the joints. Classic, easy place for them to gather, and causing that inflammation there. Caffeine, exactly the same. And, everybody perhaps has their preferred caffeine drink, but again, hugely dehydrating. And certainly there's a research to show, I think it was that it can contribute to rheumatoid arthritis, but certainly not good for any kind of inflammation in the body because it's so drying. And it also, when it targets the adrenals, sets you into a situation where you are producing cortisol and adrenaline from the response from the caffeine, because that's why caffeine gives us an energy lift, because it raises blood sugar and gives us that fast release of sugar to use for energy. But then, of course, because we store that away with the insulin we produce, it crashes very quickly. But in the meantime, it's dried us out in the process, and then it's much harder to eliminate any, as we were saying, acidic wastes that have gathered in the body. And we're stuck in a real catch-22. So thinking about salt as well, salt is highly irritating to the joints. Just recapping back and taking a step back for a moment to sugar, one of the things I particularly like to mention about bone health is that when we eat sugar, we displace calcium and magnesium from the kidneys. And so we have an automatic effect on bone health when we eat sugar. And salt, very similarly, sodium in salt, because that's all that's in processed salt and processed foods. They don't tend to use sea salt and rock salt, which have 40 to 80 other minerals in. What we get left with is the sodium, and at very high levels, which means that what's happening then is that again, you're misplacing your potassium and calcium and excreting some of those from the body again, which means that you are lowering again those lovely minerals that you need. Just to mention very quickly that if you were to want any extra help with looking at more deeply at health, I'm running a 13-week course from January 2021, covering every angle of what you need to look at for health and improving it. And there we go. Any questions about inflammation?
I lost the connection. I had to go out and come back in. So
did you get back in okay, Anne?
I just got back in now. Yeah, I don't know what went wrong. Yeah.
Right. I'm sorry about that because I didn't see that you'd.
Well, it froze, and it just, and then it went off, and then I was just said connecting. So I went out and came back in. And then
I'll send you the recording.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Mm.
Any questions?
So arthritis on your bones really is chronic inflammation, isn't it, really?
Yes, eroding the joint.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I've got that. Yeah.
And I think it's really important to think about the fact that it's not always diet. Sometimes it is stress as well. And the impacts of